This morning, I would encourage you to open up in your Bibles to Matthew, the 5th chapter. Matthew chapter 5 we'll be reading from in just a quick second. So good to be with each and every one of you this morning. It's good to have my entire family here. When I say my entire family, I don't just mean my parents. I don't just mean, well, half of my brother and sister-in-law. What I actually mean by that is our first time at services as a family of 5. If you've noticed, Melina is holding our new baby back there, which is a great time for me. But it's a good time to just enjoy being together and just enjoy this community. We've got such a loving church, and I think that's one of the things I love most about being a member here, is it's such a loving and warm congregation. And so I'm enjoying being a member here. I'm enjoying being a part of you guys. I enjoy the love that we have within this congregation. I think it's something to celebrate. We spent a lot of time this year talking about family. If you've been with us throughout the course of 2019, you know that the theme for this year has been family. So it's kind of ironic that this is the first day we're all together. We've talked a lot about parents, we've talked a lot about kids, we've talked a lot about going back to school and raising kingdom warriors. That's what we discussed last month in August. What we're going to discuss this morning, though, is probably a little bit of a different speed. We're going to talk about, instead of everybody's family getting along and everybody being happy and there always being joy in the house, so what happens when there's a little bit of disagreement, when there's a little bit of tension there? And I think probably all of us have experienced this to some degree or another, where you're in a family and there's just some kind of underlying tension, you know. And I'm not speaking from personal experience here, but maybe somebody unloaded the dishwasher the wrong way. I don't know. Somebody forgot to put away the clothes. I'm just pulling things out of thin air. Somebody didn't mow the yard the right way. But there's some kind of tension there. And instead of addressing the situation and kind of talking about it, we just kind of let things simmer. And I think all of us do this from time to time, where we don't really address the problem, and those are obviously very small problems. But whether it's big or whether it's small, we don't really address it. We just kind of let it simmer. And eventually what happens is you have this small problem or this big problem, and whatever the nucleus of the tension was, it continues to get bigger and bigger over time, whether that's hours, days, months, to the point where at some point, you're not even talking to each other. And you find yourself at dinner, and you have all the food out there, and everybody's sitting around, the TV's off, but nobody is saying anything. And that can be a very stressful and very tense situation. I'm not a counselor, I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not a therapist, but I do know, based on my limited experience, the one surefire way to get that dinner table moving, to make sure that tension breaks, the best way is just to start talking. Say something, say a silly joke, say something, but get the conversation going somehow. And I think when you look at Matthew chapter 5, Jesus talks a little bit about this, about not letting problems, not letting situations just kind of simmer, but really going after it and fixing the situation. Because once conversation is going, once the words are flowing, people are starting to talk again, then you can address what's really at the root of the issue. In Matthew chapter 5, starting verse 21, notice what Jesus says here in the Sermon on the Mount. He says, "You have heard that the ancients were told, 'You shall not commit murder, and whoever commits murder shall be liable in the court.'" Those are both great ideas and still binding under Christ. But what he says here, verse 22, takes it a step further. When he says, "I say to you, that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court, and whoever says to his brother, 'You good for nothing,' shall be guilty before the Supreme Court, and whoever says, 'You fool,'" if you have the King James Version, that's probably "you raka," "shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell." That relationships that we have with each other. Verse 23, "Therefore, if you are presenting your offering at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your offering there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and present your offering. Make friends," verse 25, "quickly with your opponent at law, while you are with them on the way, so that your opponent may not hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the officer, and you are then thrown into prison. Truly, I say to you," verse 26, "you will not come out of there until you have paid up the last cent," their last cents. There are two things that Jesus talks about here in Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 through 26. The first one is very obvious if you read those 5 or 6 verses. The first point that he makes is, solve the problems among you. And he does so, and he talks about that kind of in a semi-practical way, where he says, go solve the problems that exist amongst people, because at the very least, you want to get it situated before they come and they drag you into court, throw you into jail. That's a very practical application. But I think the underlying message there that he talks about is if you don't address it now, or within a certain reasonable period of time, it has the potential to get bigger. And all of us have known and probably seen churches, have seen families that either split up or that they don't talk to each other. And when you really kind of get down to the root of the issue, you find out that the genesis of all that was probably the most insignificant thing on the planet. But because time allowed that to fester, it ended up being a much bigger issue. But what Jesus also talks about in Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 through 26, is the effect that it has on your relationship with God. All of us that are sitting in this auditorium this morning, praising God, singing songs, worshiping Him, taking the Lord's Supper, saying prayers, but I would probably bet, and I don't know this, once again, I don't have any hard data on this, but I would bet there's probably people here that are sitting there looking crossways, probably at Joe. Maybe we're looking down the aisle at him, we're thinking to ourselves, I just can't stand him. That blue suit, I don't like it. I don't like him. I don't like the way he attacks defenseless Brady during Bible class. Don't get me started on Ken. Nathan is a whole different ballgame, but there's tension there. And I'm telling you right now, ladies and gentlemen, if there's tension among brethren, whether it's of a small, kind of insignificant issue like clothing, or if it's a much bigger issue, the absolute best way to handle that, the best treatment for it, is always to address it. I like what one preacher said one time when he said, every time he's ever approached, and he was a preacher in a rather large congregation, he said every single time he was approached by a member of the congregation who had an issue with somebody else, and it happened fairly often, he said, that's a great point, and he took him by the arm and dragged him to the other person, and he said, Howard here, that was, by the way, a name I pulled out of thin air. He said, Howard here has something that he would like to talk to you about, and then he left the situation. And he said in the course of 20, 30 years, he can count on one hand the number of issues they had that ultimately would have led, possibly, to a church split because those issues were handled immediately. The point is that Jesus is making here, Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 through 26, is you can't worship God whom you haven't seen, 1 John, if you can't even get along with the people that you do see. You have to make sure that your relationships with each other, and especially within the family units, are taken care of before we step into services, and before we think we can honor God in any kind of meaningful way. As I mentioned earlier, the antidote ultimately to any kind of tension within the house, in my opinion, is just to start talking. There has to be some kind of progression move, but it can't just be people talking endless words, endless noise. It has to be with a purpose. And so I would tell you first and foremost, when you're trying to broach this tension, when you're trying to resolve the issue at hand, I would tell you first and foremost to talk selflessly. I like that George stopped at James chapter 1 because I want to look at James chapter 4 and see what James has to say here. In James chapter 4, starting in verse 1, James is talking to a group of people who are very much divided. They're very much at each other's throats. And so his book kind of serves as a petri dish for this type of idea. But in James chapter 4, starting in verse 1, he gets very blunt in these 3 verses. He doesn't beat around the bush. He addresses quite frankly the problem. And he throws it right in their face. He says in verse 1, what is the source of quarrels and conflicts among you? Think about that. And I don't think James is being sarcastic. Think about that. It's not the source of the quarrels and the conflicts that are among you. It's not the source of that. Your pleasures that wage war in your members. In other words, selfishness is not the source of your conflict. When one person wants to get his way, the other person wants to get his way, and those 2 people cannot each have it their way. This ain't Burger King. The source of your quarrels and your conflicts is selfishness, according to verse 1. He says you lust and you don't have, so then you commit murder. You're envious and you can't obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You don't have because you don't ask. Now listen to how he addresses them in verse 3. You ask and don't receive because you ask with wrong motives, that you may spend it on your pleasures. Notice how the circular nature of this. It begins with selfishness and it ends with selfishness. Verse 4, you adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is hostility towards God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. If you want to isolate and neutralize the problems that exist within a family unit or within a church, the number one thing we all have to do is take our own ego down a notch. Take our own selfish desires, put them to the side, and ask ourselves, what's best for the other people? And we can make all the comedic remarks we want about the insignificant things that we've seen churches split over, that we've seen families yell at each other about. At the end of the day, it boils back to selfishness. In the Old Testament, Genesis chapter 13, there was an occasion where this really could have been an issue right here at the beginning. Look at Genesis chapter 13. This is this interaction between Abraham and Lot that could have been very, very explosive. Lot is Abram's nephew. Abram is a very rich man at this point. And they're settling in what is, at that point, pretty undeveloped territory. And so in Genesis chapter 13, the first 7 verses, they're dwelling together as families did. So this is very important. But the first 7 verses, you have these people dwelling together as a family unit. But eventually their space becomes too big for 2 different family units to occupy. So they have to split up. Well, listen to what Abram says here in verse 8. Abram says to Lot, please let there be no strife between you and me, nor between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brothers. I would love it, by the way, if brethren had the same attitude that Abram had in verse 8. Where he says there's strife between us, there's strife between our families, there's strife between our associates. Please let there not be any strife between us because we're brothers. Look at verse 9. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate them to me. If to the left, then I will go to the right. If to the right, I will then go to the left. What he's doing here in verse 9 of Genesis chapter 13 is giving Lot full authority over whatever it is that he wants to have. He says, look at the entire land before us. And if you want this one, I'll go here. If you want that one, I'll go over here. But I get second pick. That's Abram's genius. Verse 10, Lot lifted up his eyes and saw all the valley of the Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. This is a little bit of foreshadowing. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt as you go to Zoar. The allusion there, by the way, in verse 10 is the land that Lot is looking at reminds him, or looks like, either what they would imagine the Garden of Eden was, or what it was told to them in generations, in that traditional aspect of it. Verse 11, so Lot chose for himself all the valley of the Jordan. Lot journeyed eastward, and they separated from each other. Abram then settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled in the cities of the valley, and moved his tents as far as Sodom. What Abram did in this instance was take a step back and look at the strife that existed. And this can happen within a family all the time. They take a step back, they look at the strife that exists, and they say, this cannot happen. And so in order to get harmony back in the house, in order to get happiness and joy back in the family unit, I'm going to surrender everything. And I'm just going to let you have your way. Whatever it is that you want, just take it. Now, I understand there are situations in which that's not always the case. That's not the best move. Especially if you're standing up for something, a principle, something that needs to be a certain way. I'll let you make up your own mind with that. But 9 times out of 10, situations can be resolved by one person saying, I don't care anymore. Just take what you want. Because I value a relationship more than I value this stuff. And so if you're going to have these conversations with your family unit, maybe you're sitting here and there's tension in your family right now, the first thing you need to do is talk selflessly. Follow that up, ladies and gentlemen, by talking simply. Take a step back and don't have a whole bunch of words. Don't just start spattering off things. And I'm probably the worst person when it comes to saying, or to advising people not to saying a lot of things very fast. But don't just bombard people with words. I love what Proverbs has to say. In Proverbs chapter 10 and verse 19, he says, when there are many words, transgression is unavoidable. But he who restrains his lips is wise. And that's true just on a matter of mathematical probability. The more words you have, the more sentences that come out of your mouth, the more things that you say, the higher likelihood it is that you're probably going to say something wrong. And so take a step back, and instead of just bombarding people with words and saying this and saying that and saying this and saying that, take a step back and think to yourself, there's a real problem here. There's an idea in psychology I was reading about the other day. It's called complexity bias. You may be familiar with this. And what this principle basically teaches is that we as humans innately think that things that are more complex obviously have to be right. And so if you think about two humans, say you're going bowling, and you have two guys standing next to each other, and I'm not gonna model what bowling stands for you, even though I was on the bowling team in high school. That's a conversation for a separate time. But you have two guys that are standing next to each other, and one guy stands up and he lines himself on this dot. He holds the ball in a certain way. I always use the pinwheel. I feel like that always works best. But he lines himself a certain way, and then he does a little jig, and he throws the ball, and hits a perfect strike. You look at that, and you think to yourself, wow, there's a lot of things that went into that. That guy knew what he was doing. And then you have a guy standing right next to him, who is not even looking at the lane half the time. He grabs the ball and swings it between his legs, and granny shots it right down the middle, and it's also a strike. As a human, you're going to innately think that the person who did all these complex things, that person knows what's going on. That other person, that was just an accident. But that first person, that guy knows what he's doing. And truth be told, he probably does. But that's the way that we as humans think about relationships. That's the way we perceive the world, is that the more complex certain things are, we innately believe that that's right. And so we sometimes think as humans, if we're going to solve this relationship, we need to just bombard people with words, sentences, thoughts, explanations. When in reality, what we may need to do is just take a step back and keep our mouth shut. I love what Proverbs chapter 18 and verse 17 says. Proverbs chapter 18 and verse 17 says, the first person in any argument, and I'm paraphrasing, But the first person in any situation thinks he's right until someone comes along and examines him. You may think that you're right. You may think that because you're saying this and you're that, you're just bombarding people with words. You may think that your way is right until people take a closer examination. And they start to poke holes because your words were spoken rashly. Look at Genesis chapter 32. If you're still in Genesis 12, just fast forward 20 chapters. Look at Genesis 32. We have another instance of sibling rivalry. Genesis chapter 32. This is a sequel. This is a conclusion, more or less, to the event that happened several chapters earlier between Jacob and Esau, where Jacob essentially stole the birthright from Esau. He tricked his father Isaac into giving him the birthright. And so Jacob has since departed. Esau has gone his own way. And if you remember from the earlier instance, the last thing we see of Esau, the last words coming out of his mouth is, I'm going to kill Jacob. Now, I had a lot of issues with my brothers growing up. I never, at least one of them, I never remember saying, I'm going to kill you. I never remember that person saying it. I'll leave that up to your mind about which one was which. But that's the relationship between Jacob and Esau here. And so when you get to Genesis chapter 32, Jacob knows that Esau is incoming. You can see that at the beginning of the chapter. And in Genesis chapter 32, starting in verse 6, he divides the company. Jacob divides his family so that Esau can't kill all of them. If he kills one half the people, the other family can still escape. Verses 9 through 12, he prays towards God for protection. And note, by the way, he doesn't apologize for what happened. He never says, I wish I hadn't stolen the birthright. Never says that. What he does do is he prays for protection from God. In verses 13 through 21, he sends this elaborate set of presents to Esau, trying to butter him up. Verses 22 and 23, he puts his family in between him and Esau. So now he's got his 2 wives, or I guess his 4 wives, in between him and Esau, hoping that Esau, they'll kind of blunt the attack. And then when you get to chapter 33, this is where the story picks up. Esau and Jacob finally meet. Verse 1, Genesis 33. Jacob lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau was coming, and 400 men with him. This is not a family voyage. This is not, as Jacob's family unit is, a bunch of men, a bunch of women, a bunch of children, a bunch of servants, a bunch of flocks. This is Esau with 400 men. He divided the children then among Leah and Rachel and the 2 maids. He put the maids and their children in front, Leah and her children next, Rachel and Joseph last. But he himself passed on ahead of them and bowed down to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother. Now, if you look at this situation, this is the first time reading this, you probably think that starting in verse 4 going down, it's going to be this massive melee. Esau in verse 4, though, flips the script. Esau ran to him, to meet him, and embraced him, and fell on his neck, and he kissed him, and they then wept. And he lifted up his eyes, and he saw the women and the children, and he said, Who are these with you? And he said, The children whom God has graciously given your servant. The maids then came near with their children, and they bowed down. Leah likewise came near with her children, and they bowed down. Afterward Joseph came near with Rachel, and they bowed down. And notice what's happening here in Genesis chapter 33. Jacob is so concerned about Esau, and he has every right to be. But Jacob is so worried about what Esau is going to do that he takes all these different precautions. I'm going to split the people. I'm going to put my family here. I'm going to put the servants over here. But I'm going to do everything I can to blunt the effect of Esau seeing me. And at the end of the day, none of that even mattered. At the end of the day, Esau rolled up to him and gave him a big hug as Jacob is on the ground, picks him up and gives him a hug and cries and starts asking about his family. What this shows you is it doesn't have to be elaborate measures. We sometimes think that if we've had some huge transgression against our family member or a huge transgression against the local church, that we need to make a grand statement of repentance. And there are times when that's necessary. There are things you have to do. You have to ask for forgiveness. You have to repent. But I found that a lot of people are much more willing to forgive. If instead of having 400 reasons why what you did wasn't really that bad, or why it wasn't really your fault, you simply say the statement, I was wrong. Please forgive me. I think we as humans need to learn how to talk simply to each other. Instead of apologizing for everything and instead of making up all the reasons why what went wrong wasn't my fault, and why what happened wasn't really as bad as you think, we need to talk simpler to each other. And also, we need to talk softly. Proverbs chapter 15 and verse 1, Solomon again says, A gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. That's exactly right. As I just mentioned, oftentimes the temptation is to start explaining yourself, and to start making excuses. If you remember when God, in the Garden of Eden, sees Adam and Eve, and the first thing God does is says, "Did you eat of this fruit?" Remember what Adam says? "Well, it wasn't me. It was Eve. She gave to me and I ate." "Eve, did you eat the fruit?" "Well, it wasn't me. It was Satan. He convinced me. He tricked me. And that's why I'm guilty of all this." And you can see how that starts this kind of downward spiral. They were absolutely guilty. But instead of owning up to it, they just moved the buck to somebody else. Proverbs chapter 15:1, gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. Later in the book of Proverbs, chapter 30. Proverbs chapter 30, starting in verse 32. Proverbs chapter 30, verse 32. He says, "If you have been foolish and exalting yourself," which who hasn't? Who hasn't been foolish and exalting ourselves at some point? Or if you have plotted evil, here's what you do. Put your hand on your mouth. Stop your mouth right now. If you have been foolish and exalting yourself, if you have plotted evil, put your hand on your mouth. For the churning of milk, listen to this, produces butter, and pressing the nose brings forth blood, and the churning of anger produces strife. In other words, if you're guilty of false pride, if you're plotting evil, if you've been caught, if you've done something you shouldn't, instead of explaining it, put your hand over your mouth. Because there's a high probability that you're just going to make it worse. Now, if you look elsewhere in the book of Proverbs, Solomon talks about this idea a lot. He talks about it chapter 29 and verse 22, chapter 28, chapter 26, chapter 17, chapter 15. And so the question comes up, why is it, do you think, that Solomon is so good about realizing that words oftentimes don't exactly mean or the ends that you want? That words can't solve everything. That you can't talk your way out of a situation. And a cynic would say, well, it's because he was married to 700 women. That's how he realized that you can't just talk your way out of things. That's not what I think it is. I think what Solomon realizes throughout the course of the book of Proverbs, and you see it within his own life to a certain extent, even though he fails on it numerous times, what Solomon realizes is that actions far outweigh what comes out of your mouth. For instance, if you think about in 1 Kings chapter 4, when he has this almost legendary discussion with him and the two women, the two harlots. And these two harlots come to him with this question that nobody can really solve. And this is before DNA testing, all these different things. These two harlots come to him and they say, "This baby is here and it's my baby. I know that because she rolled over her baby in the middle of the night." And then that other woman says, "Well, no, that's my baby. She stole it from me in the middle of the night." And nobody really knows what the right answer is. And before you have DNA testing, before you have fingerprint analysis, Solomon can't look at that and say, well, this is obviously right based on this proof. This woman has claimed because of this evidence. It's before all that. But what does he do? He pulls out a sword and he threatens to divide the baby. Because what he knows in 1 Kings chapter 4 is that no matter what everybody says, the actions of the true mom are going to come forward. Ladies and gentlemen, when we apologize to people, and when we mess up, and we do all these things that are wrong, and we come to them with quote and words and apologies and all these things that we say, and we don't back it up with emotions, or we don't back it up with actions, then those words are hollow. Those words don't mean anything. If we come to God with a sin that we've done that's grave, or even if a sin that we've done thousands of times, and we come to Him every single time, "I'm sorry, Lord, please forgive me, next time I'll do better," and then we leave that prayer with no intention of doing better, then how good is that prayer? And the same happens in interpersonal relationships all the time. If we've wronged our family member, if there's tension in our house because of me, and I come up with a million excuses for why it's not that bad, it's not my fault, or I say, "I'll do this, I'll do this, I'll do this, I'll do this," and then I don't ever have the actions to back it up. Those words are useless. Solomon understands the same thing that God understands, which is the same thing that we need to understand, which is actions vastly outweigh what comes out of our mouth. Talk softly, but act big. Last thing I would tell you, this is the final thing that we'll talk about. We need to talk steadfastly. I fear sometimes that what happens when we start talking when we have these interpersonal relationships, we have these conflicts, I fear what happens or what gets lost in that shuffle is we lose the fact that there's a very real soul behind it. I've seen churches divide. You've seen probably more churches than me divide over the silliest little issues. And you've seen friendships and families not speak to each other for years because of little minor disagreements or even big disagreements. And what gets lost in that shuffle, when the anger and the vitriol is being thrown back and forth, what gets lost in that whole shuffle is the fact that on the other side of the aisle, contained in the church that split off of us, or the family member, or the uncle that we haven't talked to in 20 years, or our sibling that we don't really like anymore. What's contained within that person is a soul that Jesus died to save. I love what Paul says in Romans chapter 14. Look over there. I know you're probably in Proverbs, ignore that. Look at Romans chapter 14. There's a verse that I always come back to in conversations like this. And if you're not familiar with Romans chapter 14, it's probably because you haven't been in the center of a church split. Because Romans 14 is used both as a weapon and as a defensive measure to argue about conscience. And that's what Romans 14 is largely about. It's about liberty. Taking things at liberty and allowing other people to do things at liberty. In Romans chapter 14, though, Paul, I like how he kind of puts a caveat on it. In Romans chapter 14, starting in verse 13, listen to this. He says, therefore, let us not judge one another anymore. Now, keep in mind, he is not talking about matters of doctrine. He's not talking about things that will save your soul or condemn your soul. He's talking about matters of liberty. He says in verse 13, let us not judge one another anymore, but rather determine this novel concept, not to put an obstacle or a stumbling block in a brother's way. I know, verse 14, and I am convinced in the Lord Jesus that nothing is unclean in itself, but to him who thinks anything to be unclean, to him it is unclean. What he shows in verse 14 is a very real difference in faith. I know, Paul says, this isn't unclean. And he's saying that from a heavily Jewish, Pharisaical background. I know that there's nothing unclean here. If somebody else may come along because they're weaker in the faith, they're newer in the faith, whatever the situation is, and neither of those are bad things, they may look at that exact same thing and they say, I can't partake because it's unclean. And what Paul says in Romans chapter 14 is, let him have that faith to himself. Don't put an obstacle in his way that causes his faith or his conscience to be contaminated. Don't cause him to stumble because you have faith that he doesn't. Let somebody else have their liberty for the moment, at least in terms of opinion. So look at verse 15. And I love verse 15. He says, if because of food your brother is hurt, you are no longer walking according to love. And if you highlight or underline in your Bible, this is a fantastic phrase right here. Do not destroy with your food him for whom Christ died. What a powerful statement. And what a powerful verse that I think all of us could do well to commit to memory, to have it blazoned on our forehead, at the forefront of our brain, to think to ourselves at any time we're in any sort of disagreement, whether that's as a member of a church, whether that's as a member of a family, whether that's a married couple, to think to yourself, do not destroy with food that for which Christ died to save. Jesus Christ did not go to the cross so that you could have your favorite color of carpet inside the church building. Or that you could have your favorite parking spots. Or that you could choose whether or not you're going to watch the Cowboys this afternoon or whoever else is out there playing. He didn't die to save that. He died to save your soul. And when we're in the middle of these disagreements, whatever that situation is, we need to keep them in the forefront of our mind. Because the goal of any disagreement is not to get our way, but to restore that relationship and to ultimately help that person get to heaven. 2 Timothy chapter 4, the very last chapter that Paul, at least that we know of, would ever write. Paul talks about all these different people. He mentions Demas. He talks about a couple other people. He says, who once was forsaken. And he talks about John Mark, people who were once forsaken, but now have proven useful to him. And there are people all over this world, and you probably have these people in your life, I have them in my life, people who we don't necessarily talk to anymore. But if we would take a step back and try to restore that relationship, it could not just be great friends in our life, great family members in our life. It could really be assets for our own spiritual walk with God. If we would simply restore that relationship. Remember, ladies and gentlemen, there is a soul in that person that you're arguing with. That person that you haven't spoken to in 20 years, that person has a soul that will someday stand before God and give an account of their own life and how they treated you. But just as surely as they stand before God and give an account of their life and how they treated you, you will stand before God and give an account of how you treated them. Remember that all is the same. And don't destroy that for which Christ died. We haven't talked this morning about what it takes to become a child of God, but that lesson has been taught numerous times here, and I'm more than willing to talk about it now. You have to repent, you have to be baptized and put on Jesus through the waters of baptism. Rise to walk in newness of life, putting that old death or that old life to death, establishing a relationship with Him that is bound in obedience, repentance, and trust. And I promise you that upon doing that, you enter into the greatest community, the greatest entity that has ever existed in the world, which is the Lord's church. If there are needs, if you have needs this morning, if you're away from God or you need to come back, I encourage you, make that call and let